The world's most dangerous choke point is no longer in Iran's hands the way Tehran once believed it was. A quiet but seismic strategic realignment is unfolding in the Persian Gulf, and most of the world has not yet grasped what it truly means. What has just happened in the United Arab Emirates does not merely affect oil prices or shipping lanes. It restructures the entire foundation upon which Iran has built its leverage over the global economy for decades. To understand the full weight of this moment, one must go back to the original premise of Iranian power in the region. Iran's most potent non-nuclear weapon has never been its missiles, its proxies, or even its Revolutionary Guard. It has been geography. The Islamic Republic sits on the northern coast of the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage barely 33 kilometers wide at its tightest point, through which roughly one-fifth of all the world's traded oil flows every single day. For decades, Tehran has treated this geographic reality as an insurance policy, a trump card, and a negotiating weapon all at once. The logic was always brutally simple. If you pressure Iran too hard through sanctions, through military posturing, through diplomatic isolation, Iran could threaten or even attempt to close the strait. The mere suggestion of such a move has historically been enough to spike global oil markets, rattle Western capitals, and force adversaries into moments of hesitation. Iran did not need to actually close the strait to derive power from it. The credibility of the threat alone was sufficient. But what this really signals is that the era of Hormuz as Iran's uncontested strategic lever is entering a phase of managed obsolescence. And the architect of that obsolescence is not Washington. It is Abu Dhabi. The United Arab Emirates has spent the better part of 2 decades quietly engineering a future in which Iranian coercion over energy flows becomes economically irrelevant to the UAE itself, and by extension to a growing number of the world's most important energy consumers. The centerpiece of this strategy is the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, a project whose full strategic implications have been systematically underplayed in mainstream geopolitical commentary. This pipeline runs from the oil fields of Abu Dhabi's interior all the way to the Emirate of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz entirely. What that means in practical terms is that the UAE can export its oil without a single tanker ever passing through the strait. The capacity of this pipeline is substantial, capable of transporting the overwhelming majority of Abu Dhabi's crude oil production directly to international markets through a route that Iran cannot credibly threaten to interdict. The deeper implication is one that has not been openly discussed with the seriousness it deserves. When a major Gulf oil exporter successfully bypasses the Strait of Hormuz as a matter of routine infrastructure, it does not merely protect that nation's own revenue stream. It begins to erode the foundational premise of Iranian leverage over the entire global energy architecture. And once that erosion begins, it does not stop with the UAE alone. Consider the strategic position of Saudi Arabia. The kingdom has long maintained the east-west pipeline, known as the Petroline, capable of routing significant volumes of oil to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, bypassing the Gulf entirely. Iraq has been investing in southern port infrastructure. Qatar, while primarily a gas exporter operating under different dynamics, is keenly aware of the shifting geography of Gulf power. What is emerging is not merely a single bypass route, but a systemic re-engineering of the regional energy infrastructure, specifically designed to make Iranian threats at Hormuz progressively less catastrophic for the global economy. Iran's leadership understands this, and that understanding produces a specific kind of strategic anxiety, the anxiety of watching your most powerful non-military instrument slowly rendered obsolete while you remain too economically constrained, too diplomatically isolated, and too internally fractured to build a credible replacement. What is not being openly discussed is how dramatically this changes Iran's calculus in its ongoing negotiations with the international community. For years, Western negotiators have had to account for the Hormuz variable when calculating how hard to push Tehran. Every sanctions package, every diplomatic ultimatum, every demand for nuclear concessions had to be weighed against the risk that Iranian desperation might translate into a Hormuz closure attempt, an act that would damage Iran itself severely but would also send global energy markets into a period of extreme volatility. As bypass capacity increases, as the UAE's Fujairah route operates at full efficiency, as Saudi pipeline alternatives mature, as new terminals are developed on non-Gulf coastlines, that calculus shifts fundamentally. The cost-benefit analysis of pressuring Iran changes. The leverage Tehran held through geography diminishes. And with that diminishment comes a new and more dangerous reality for the Islamic Republic. A state that has lost its primary bargaining chip does not simply become more compliant. Often it becomes more erratic. The historical pattern is consistent. Powers that see their strategic leverage eroding tend to either accelerate accommodation or accelerate confrontation. For Iran, Given the internal dynamics of its political system, given the balance of power between its reformist factions and its hardline Revolutionary Guard establishment, the path toward rational accommodation has always been the more difficult one to walk. What this moment in the UAE represents is therefore not just an infrastructure milestone. It is a geopolitical pressure point that will force Tehran to make choices it has been successfully avoiding for years. Does Iran double down on its nuclear program as the last remaining source of existential deterrence? Does it intensify its proxy network in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Gaza as a way of demonstrating regional reach even as its Hormuz card weakens? Or does it seek a genuine strategic accommodation with the West, accepting constraints it has previously refused in exchange for economic relief and international reintegration? The UAE's moves in this context are not merely passive infrastructure decisions. They are active geopolitical choices, choices that have been made with full awareness of their implications for Iranian power. Abu Dhabi and Tehran have maintained a complex and often deliberately ambiguous relationship over the years. The UAE hosts a large Iranian expatriate community. Significant informal trade has historically flowed between the two sides. There have been back-channel communications, quiet understandings, and a general preference in UAE diplomatic culture for managing tensions through commerce rather than confrontation. But the construction and operational prioritization of the Fujairah bypass route sends a message that transcends commercial logic. It says, we are not willing to remain indefinitely vulnerable to your geography. We are not willing to allow the threat of Hormuz closure to hang over our economic future. And we have the means, the capital, and the strategic patience to build our way out of that vulnerability. The timing of the UAE's assertiveness in this regard is also inseparable from the broader regional realignment that has accelerated over the past several years. The Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between the UAE and Israel, represented a tectonic shift in the region's strategic geometry. For the first time in decades, a major Arab Gulf state publicly acknowledged that its security interests aligned more closely with Israel and by extension with the United States in a broadly Western strategic orientation than with the older Arab solidarity framework that had previously constrained such alignments. What this really signals in the aftermath of the Abraham Accords is that the UAE has decisively positioned itself as a node in an alternative regional security architecture, one explicitly designed to counterbalance Iranian influence. The Hormuz bypass is not separate from this broader realignment. It is integral to it. It is the economic and infrastructural expression of the same strategic logic that drove the normalization agreement. Iran's response to the Abraham Accords was a mixture of public fury and private alarm. The public messaging was predictable. Condemnation of Arab states that chose normalization, accusations of betrayal of the Palestinian cause, warnings of consequences. But the private alarm was about something deeper and more structural. The recognition that the UAE and other Gulf states were no longer calculating their security purely through the lens of Arab-Israeli dynamics, but through the lens of a direct Iranian threat to their own stability and prosperity. The deeper implication of this regional realignment for Iran's Hormuz strategy is profound. When it was only Iran and the United States facing each other across the Strait, Tehran could reasonably present the confrontation as one between an imperial power and a sovereign nation defending its dignity. That narrative, whatever its analytical limitations, carried real weight in parts of the global south and even in some quarters of European opinion. But when the UAE, a fellow Muslim-majority state, a fellow developing nation that has built its prosperity through commerce and openness rather than ideological confrontation, begins systematically building infrastructure to circumvent Iranian leverage, the narrative becomes harder to sustain. The isolation is no longer solely a Western imposition. It is becoming increasingly a regional reality. One must also examine what the UAE strategic moves mean for the countries that matter most in the global energy equation. The major Asian importers, China, India, South Korea, and Japan, together account for an enormous share of the Persian Gulf's oil exports. For all of these countries, the reliability of supply through the Strait of Hormuz has been a source of persistent strategic anxiety. Any disruption, whether caused by Iranian action, military confrontation, or even the credible threat thereof, translates directly into economic instability for economies that depend heavily on consistent energy imports. The development of bypass routes changes this calculus for Asian importers in ways that subtly but significantly shift their relationship with both the UAE and Iran. When a country can receive UAE oil that has never passed through the Strait, it gains a supply option that is genuinely insulated from Iranian coercion. That insulation has value, real quantifiable strategic value. And states that provide that insulated supply gain leverage in their relationships with importers that states relying on Strait passage simply cannot match. China's relationship with Iran has been one of the most closely watched dynamics in global energy geopolitics. Beijing has been Iran's most significant economic lifeline during periods of intense Western sanctions, purchasing Iranian oil through mechanisms designed to minimize the visibility of transactions and thereby reduce the risk of secondary sanctions on Chinese entities. This relationship has given Iran a degree of economic resilience it could not otherwise have maintained. But what is not being openly discussed is the degree to which China's strategic patience with Iran is finite. Beijing's primary concern is the uninterrupted flow of energy to fuel its economy and its ambitions. Iran's utility to China has always been partly as a supplier and partly as a geopolitical counterweight to American dominance in the Gulf region. The moment Iranian provocations, real or threatened, begin to create supply disruptions that affect Chinese energy security, Beijing's calculus will shift. China does not practice ideological loyalty in its foreign policy. It practices interest-based calculation with exceptional discipline and long-time horizons. The UAE's development of Fujairah as a world-class oil export hub with deep water terminals, extensive storage capacity, and direct access to the Indian Ocean, positions Abu Dhabi as an increasingly attractive partner for exactly those Asian importers that China's own state energy companies must constantly work to supply. There is a quiet competition here, beneath the surface of the diplomatic pleasantries, for the energy loyalty of Asia's great economies. And the UAE is winning ground in that competition precisely because it can offer what Iran structurally cannot: reliability, bypass capability, and freedom from the specter of self-inflicted supply disruption. For Iran, the loss of relevance as a reliable supplier, as opposed to a discounted emergency option, is a long-term wound that compounds the damage done by the erosion of the Hormuz leverage. Tehran needs oil revenues not merely to fund government operations, but to maintain the internal social contract that keeps the regime functional. Sanctions have already squeezed that revenue dramatically. As buyers gain more alternatives, as bypass routes reduce the premium attached to Iranian oil's geographic position, the downward pressure on Iran's income intensifies. The internal political implications of this economic pressure are significant and often underestimated. The Iranian system is not monolithic. There are factions with genuinely different views about how to respond to external pressure, different assessments of what Iran's strategic interests require, and different calculations about the costs and benefits of continued confrontation. The hardline Revolutionary Guard establishment has institutional incentives to maintain a posture of defiance. Its budget, its autonomy, its domestic political power all depend on the perpetuation of a siege mentality and an external threat environment. But there are other voices within the Iranian system: technocrats, economists, members of a battered middle class that has watched decades of potential prosperity dissolve under the weight of ideological foreign policy choices, who understand that the trajectory is unsustainable. The question of which faction prevails in the ongoing internal struggle for strategic direction is not determined solely by ideas or arguments. It is determined significantly by economic reality, and the economic reality being shaped by UAE infrastructure decisions, by regional realignment, and by the slow erosion of Hormuz leverage, is one that strengthens the hand of those within Iran who argue for a fundamentally different strategic posture. This is the hidden dimension of what the UAE has accomplished. By building infrastructure and deepening alliances that reduce Iran's coercive power, Abu Dhabi is not merely protecting its own interests. It is perhaps inadvertently altering the internal balance within Iranian politics, creating conditions under which the argument for strategic retrenchment becomes more compelling to those within the system who are persuadable. Whether that internal shift can overcome the institutional power of the Revolutionary Guard, and whether any resulting diplomatic opening would be met with genuine seriousness by Western powers, are questions that remain open and deeply uncertain. The history of Iranian Western diplomacy is littered with moments of apparent breakthrough that collapsed under the weight of mutual mistrust, domestic political dynamics on both sides, and the persistent gap between what each party says it wants and what it actually needs from a strategic deal. What this really signals is that the next chapter of the Iranian strategic story will be written not primarily in the nuclear negotiations that absorb so much diplomatic attention, but in the quieter, slower, more structural contest over energy geography, regional alignment, and economic leverage. The Strait of Hormuz will remain a physical choke point. Tankers will continue to pass through it. The Iranian coastline will not move, but the power that geography confers upon the state that sits upon it is not fixed. It is a function of alternatives, and alternatives are being built. The UAE's decision to operationalize and expand the Fujairah bypass to position Fujairah as a genuine global energy hub rather than merely a contingency option is a strategic act of the highest order. It is being conducted with the quiet confidence of a state that has decided it will not remain a hostage to its own neighborhood's most volatile actor. It is being conducted with the long-term perspective of a government that measures strategic success not in news cycles, but in decades of compounded advantage. There is a certain irony in the fact that one of the most consequential strategic moves against Iranian power in the contemporary era is being made not by a Western military, not by Israeli intelligence operations, and not by American sanctions architects, but by a small Gulf state that has built its global relevance through commerce, openness, and a relentless focus on infrastructure and connectivity. The UAE has found a way to reduce Iranian leverage that does not require a single shot to be fired, does not require a UN Security Council resolution, and does not require the consent of any great power. It requires only capital, engineering, and strategic vision. For those who study the long arc of geopolitical competition, this pattern is recognizable. The most durable shifts in the balance of power are rarely achieved through the dramatic instruments of force or formal diplomacy. They are achieved through the patient construction of facts on the ground, or in this case, facts underground, running through pipelines beneath the desert to a coastline Iran cannot touch. The question that now hangs over the Persian Gulf is what Iran will do as it processes the cumulative weight of these structural changes. A nation watching its leverage erode, its economy contract, its regional influence contested, and its internal divisions deepen is a nation facing a choice that history has posed to many states in analogous positions. Some choose adaptation, accepting a diminished but sustainable role in the regional order in exchange for economic recovery and gradual rehabilitation. Others choose escalation, doubling down on the instruments of coercion and confrontation in an attempt to force the environment to yield to their will rather than adjusting their will to the environment. The dangerous middle path, the one that history suggests is most common and most destabilizing, is a prolonged oscillation between the two, driven by internal factional competition, tactical opportunism, and the absence of any settled strategic consensus. A state oscillating between accommodation and escalation is a state that keeps every player in the region permanently off balance, permanently uncertain about whether the next move will be toward dialogue or provocation. That permanent uncertainty is itself a form of leverage, perhaps the last significant form of leverage that remains credible to Tehran as its Hormuz card is steadily diminished. And it is worth noting that the UAE, for all its strategic sophistication, cannot fully hedge against that uncertainty. No amount of pipeline infrastructure eliminates the risk that a desperate or miscalculating Iranian leadership might take actions against shipping, against regional infrastructure, against partner states that create a broader conflict no bypass route can simply sidestep. This is the final uncomfortable truth about what has unfolded in the Persian Gulf. The UAE has made a brilliant strategic move. It has reduced its own vulnerability, expanded its geopolitical relevance, deepened its relationships with the states that matter most, and accelerated the erosion of a specific Iranian leverage instrument that has constrained Western and regional policy for decades. But brilliant strategic moves in a neighborhood as volatile as the Persian Gulf do not eliminate risk. They redirect it, concentrate it in different places, and sometimes accelerate the arrival of a crisis that might otherwise have been deferred. The Strait of Hormuz is not gone. The threat is not gone. What is gone, slowly, structurally, irreversibly, is the era in which a single nation's geographic position was sufficient to hold an entire region's economic future hostage. What replaces it is a more complex, more contested, and in some ways more dangerous landscape, where the old certainties of coercion have been disrupted, but the new architecture of stability has not yet been fully constructed. In the long history of geopolitical competition, the most dangerous moments are not those of clear dominance or clear weakness. They are the transition moments, when one order is visibly fading and the next has not yet solidified. The Persian Gulf is living through exactly such a transition, and the decisions made by every actor in this drama over the coming years will determine whether that transition leads to a more stable and prosperous regional order, or to the kind of convulsive reckoning that has periodically reshaped the Middle East throughout its modern history. Power does not vanish, it migrates, and right now it is migrating away from the northern shore of a narrow strait, through a pipeline in the Abu Dhabi desert, to a deep water terminal on a coastline that no Iranian general can credibly threaten. That migration is one of the most important geopolitical stories of this era, and most of the world is still not paying close enough attention.